Have you ever noticed someone who just stopped justifying their choices? No announcement, no argument. They just went quiet and started moving differently. And somehow, that stillness made them more magnetic, not less. Psychology says that's not indifference. That's one of the rarest forms of emotional growth a person can reach. So let's talk about what's actually happening in the mind of someone who stops explaining themselves and why it signals something most people never develop. 1. Their identity became internal. For most people, self-worth lives in other people's reactions. So they explain, defend, and over-clarify, because silence feels like losing. But at some point, emotionally evolved people stop outsourcing their sense of reality. Psychologists call this internal locus of control. You stop needing the room to agree with you because you already know what's true. 2. They recognized explanation as a trauma response. This one's subtle but important. A lot of people who over-explain learned early on that conflict was dangerous, so they became preemptive peacekeepers. When someone finally stops compulsively justifying themselves, it's often because they've done real inner work. They realize the people who truly get them never needed the explanation to begin with. 3. Their energy got too precious to spend on doubt. High-functioning, self-aware people eventually notice a pattern. The more they explain, the more they're questioned. It's not a conversation, it's a loop. Psychology calls this emotional labor, and it drains the same cognitive resources you need for focus, creativity, and clarity. Stopping isn't stubbornness, it's resource management. 4. They stopped performing confidence and started living it. There's a big difference between people who talk about their decisions constantly and people who just make them. When someone goes quiet about their choices, it's usually because the choice is already made. They've moved from seeking approval to seeking results. Real confidence doesn't need a witness. 5. They developed a deep tolerance for being misunderstood. This is the hard one. Most people can't sit with being seen incorrectly. It feels unbearable. But people who stop explaining themselves have built something psychologists call distress tolerance. They've accepted that not everyone has the context, the capacity, or the desire to understand them. And they made peace with that. Not bitterly, just honestly. 6. They chose peace over being right. And this is probably the biggest shift. Somewhere along the way, they realized that winning an argument and actually being understood are two completely different things. One costs everything. One gives you nothing. When someone stops explaining themselves, they're not giving up. They're upgrading what they're even playing for. So if you've caught yourself lately not bothering to defend a decision, not justifying a boundary, not explaining why you needed space, that's not coldness, that's clarity. That's your mind finally trusting itself more than it fears judgment. If you're into the psychology of quiet confidence, emotional maturity, and how the most self-aware people actually operate, subscribe. Because the most interesting minds aren't the loudest ones in the room.